The wind off the Cornadoo Peninsula arrived at 0614 and 11-knot gusts carrying salt and the particular cold that never quite leaves the Pacific coast. Even in September, Master Chief Petty Officer Dale Reed had been standing on the observation platform for 41 minutes, watching the trainee below move through the final phase of the live fire qualification drill. And in 41 minutes, he had not moved, had not spoken, had not done anything except watch the woman at position 7 with the kind of attention he normally reserved for things he could not explain. She was third from the left in a line of 9 trainees, all of them prone, all of them behind identical M110 automatic sniper systems, all of them waiting for the range officer's command. The targets were set at 600 m on the primary line, with a secondary set at 847 m at the range cadre had quietly positioned without formal announcement. A test within a test added that morning at Reeves's request, though he had not told anyone why he requested it. He had just asked. He had learned in 33 years, music, of naval special warfare, that sometimes you ask for things before you fully understand why you're asking for them. The range officer called the command. 8 trainees fired. She didn't. Reeves watched her. Her right hand had moved 2 cm, not to the trigger, but to the elevation turret on the scope. A half rotation, maybe 3/4. It took her less than 2 seconds. Then she fired. The spotter behind her said nothing for a moment. Then he said, secondary target. 847 impact. Reeves did not move. He did not write anything on the clipboard he was holding. He just looked at the position where she was already cycling back to the primary target. Her breathing unchanged, her shoulders still, as if what she had just done was simply the next item on a list she had prepared the night before and seen no reason to revise. This was the first thing he would remember years later when people asked him where it began. Not the subsequent weeks, not the classified briefings, not the night on the mountain in the dark with the wind and the blood and the silence that followed a single shot. Just this, a woman at 847 m making a half rotation correction in 2 seconds and then moving on as if the distance were okay to see she had extended to the target rather than a problem she had solved. The Naval Special Wharf Command Training Annex at Coronado occupies 340 acres of coastal terrain, and it has been producing, refining, and occasionally breaking human beings for 6 decades. The buildings along the western edge are the administrative structures, the ones with the laminate flooring and the fluorescent lighting and the conference tables where the curriculum meetings happen and the performance reviews are filed. The buildings along the eastern edge are the ones that matter. Those are the structures that smell like seawater and gun oil and the particular sweat produced by sustained physical effort under controlled fear. Dale Reeves had been assigned to Coronado twice in his career, once as a trainee 27 years earlier and once as a training evaluator, which was what he was now, though evaluator was a bureaucratic reduction of what he actually did. What he actually did was watch. He had spent 33 years in Naval Special Wolf watching people. And he had become, over those 33 years, unusually precise about what he was seeing. He could watch a man do a 3-mile swim in 52 degrees water and tell you within 4 minutes, either way, what that man's time would be before he finished. He could watch a trainee handle a weapons malfunction and tell you whether that trainee would last the program inside of 10 seconds. He had in 33 years been wrong about this 11 times. He knew the exact number because he kept a log. Precision was not a habit for Reeves. It was closer to a conviction. He had been assigned to evaluate the current class of advanced training candidates. 31 individuals who had each already passed the initial qualification pipeline and were now moving through the specialized skills phase, which included advanced marksmanship, close quarters methodology, trauma medicine, and a classified surveillance component that did not appear in the public F-facing curriculum documents. Of those 31, 4 women. Of those 4, one was Elena Vasquez. She appeared in the program records as what the administrative documentation described as a provisional cross-service candidate, a classification Ree had seen applied to a handful of people over the years, most of them with unusual interagency histories. The program records said she was 28 years old, that she had completed 2 years of prior military service in a different branch, and that she had been referred to the program through a channel Reeves had been briefly told about and then told not to discuss. The record contained 14 pages. Reeves had read all 14. He had also noticed that 14 pages was roughly half what a normal candidate file contained. The other half was somewhere else. He watched her come off the range at 0702 with the other trainees, all of them carrying their weapons at the low ready, all of them moving toward the cleaning stations in the formation the range Carter expected. She moved at the same pace as the others. She carried the M110 the same way the others carried it. She was 5 feet 7 inches and 134 pounds with dark hair pulled back and the kind of face that doesn't give you much unless you know what to look for. She wore the same sand-colored training uniform as everyone else. And she had the same expression as everyone else, which was not an expression at all, which was the particular flatness that the program produced after enough time. The face that has learned to conceive everything but her hands. Reeves noticed her hands when she set the weapon on the cleaning rack. She cleaned the M110 with the kind of deliberateness that is different from carefulness. Carefulness is what you see in trainee who are worried about making mistakes. What she had was something else. She ran the bull brush through the barrel in exactly 4 strokes on the push and 3 on the pull, which was not the number the program mandated, which was 5 and 4. It was, however, the number used in a particular foreign rifle qualification protocol that Ree had encountered exactly once in 2011 at a joint training exercise he was not going to think about right now. He made a note on the clipboard. The skeptic standing 12 feet to Reeves's left was Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Brandt. 22 years in 3 combat deployments. A man who had the kind of professional record that made his opinions matter in rooms where opinions were argued, rather than simply stated. Brandt had been watching the class for the past 6 days and had on the previous afternoon told Reeves that Elena Vasquez was a solid B-plus candidate with a tendency to overthink her when corrections. He had said it with the confidence of someone who had been making this kind of assessment for a long time and did not expect to be revised. She went to the secondary, Reeves said. Brandt looked at him. No one goes to the secondary on the call drill. That's not in the block. I know. She probably saw the target by accident and engaged it reflexively. Reeves did not say anything. He looked at his clipboard. He had written 847 M2s. No adjustment. Pause. Pre-calculated. She pre-calculated for the secondary. Reeves said before the command to fire. Brandt was quiet for a moment. That's a guess. She adjusted 847 M in 2 seconds with no confirmation from the spotter. Reeves said, "You don't do that by accident. You do that if you already know the number." Brandt looked back at the cleaning station where Elena Vasquez was now reassembling the M110 in the same methodical, non-hurried way she had cleaned it. "She's a provisional candidate," he said. 2 years prior service. She shouldn't be pre-calculating anything in an unfamiliar range environment. No, Reeves said she shouldn't. He left it there. He had learned in 33 years that there are things you don't push past the edge of the evidence. Not until you have more of it. The question was present. He wasn't going to name it yet. The second thing Reeves noticed was on day 12 during the water infiltration component, which placed trainees in 58 degrees water in complete darkness for a minimum of 4 hours with navigational tasks assigned at irregular intervals and no guarantee of when the evolution would end. It was the kind of test that was not really testing navigation. It was testing the relationship between the mind and the body when the body has been reduced to a state of cold-induced degradation and the mind is required to continue performing arithmetic. He was watching from the monitoring station in dry gear, reviewing the thermal imaging feeds from the 4 cameras positioned around the training bay. The trainees were visible as white outlines on the black monitor screen. 31 shapes moving through water, each assigned a transponder number. He had the numbers meme. He watched number 17, Elena Vasquez, move through the first navigational leg with the same efficiency she brought to everything. The course required trainees to locate 3 submerged markers using handheld compasses and dead reckoning in that order at depth before surfacing for the next instruction. The average time for a trained candidate on this component was 22 minutes per leg. The fastest recorded time in the program's history was 17 minutes. set by a Budo instructor who had been running the course as a demonstration. She completed the first leg in 15 minutes and 40 seconds. Reeves looked at the clock. He looked back at the screen. He watched her surface, received the instruction from the safety diver, and returned to depth without the kind of hesitation that most trainees showed between legs. The moment where the body argues with the decision to go back in a 58-degree water and has to be overruled. She went back in the way someone goes back to a task they left briefly, not the way someone re-enters something that is costing them. Maris Brandt came in from the observation deck and stood next to Reeves' station. He was holding a mug of coffee that he wasn't drinking. He looked at the thermal screen. 17ths on the second leg already, he said. 15:40. Brandt set the mug down. He looked at the screen for a moment without saying anything. That's a lot of hours in cold water before this program. He said to move like that in the dark. Yes, Reeves said. Her file says 2 years prior service. That's what her file says. Brandt picked up the mug again. He didn't drink from it. He was watching the screen the way Reeves had been watching it, with a particular quality of attention that professional observers bring to things that don't fit the model they're working from. On the screen, number 17 located the second marker at minute 31. She was 11 minutes ahead of the class average at the same point in the evolution. The third thing Reeves noticed happened at 0340 the following morning during what the program called an unscheduled assessment, which was a program's way of describing waking the trainees without warning and running them through a task before their bodies had come fully out of sleep. The task that morning was a timed weapons assembly in darkness, requiring trainees to disassemble and reassemble the 11 Malawi and Kwa sniper system by touch in under 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The pass threshold was 4:30. The average time in the current class on previous assessments in full daylight was 3:55. In darkness, the average typically extended by 45 seconds to a minute. Elena Vasquez completed the reassembly at 2 minutes and 58 seconds. In darkness, after being woken from 4 hours of sleep following a water evolution, Ree was standing 6 feet away. He had not been watching the clock when she started because he had been watching another trainee who was struggling with the bolt group. He caught her finish time from the evaluator's sheet. Afterward, he went to the evaluator, a petty officer first class named Torres, and asked him if the time had been logged correctly. Torres said he had logged it twice because he hadn't believed it the first time. Reeves stood in the corridor outside the training bay for a moment after Torres went back inside. The corridor was empty and fluorescently lit and smelled like the cleaning solvent that was everywhere in this building. He was holding the clipboard he always carried, and he looked at the 3 notes he had made over the past 12 days. 8:47 M2's pre-calculated 15:40 cold water first leg, 258 darkness assembly. The question had an outline now. He wasn't ready to name it, but the outline was there. The incident with the medical kit happened on day 16, and it was the thing that moved Brandt from professional skepticism into the territory of reluctant revision, which in Brandt's case was a significant journey. The class had been running a field exercise in the brush terrain east of the main complex. A land navigation component combined with a simulated small unit reconnaissance task that required trainees to move through approximately 11 kilometers of terrain in 6-person teams, with objective checkpoints positioned at intervals designed to require route decisions under time pressure. The exercise was expected to take 7 to 10 hours. At hour 4, Trainee Harrington, a 26-year-old former Army Ranger with a competition marksmanship background that had made him the early front-runner in the class, stepped into a concealed depression in the terrain and hyperextended his right knee, damaging the anterior cruciate and the medial collateral ligament in the kind of mechanical injury that stops people in the field and requires medevac and surgery and months of structured rehabilitation. He went down without sound, which was the Ranger in him, and the team stopped. They were 4.3 kilometers from the nearest checkpoint. Elena Vasquez was not the team medic. That designation in her 6-person element had gone to a trainee named Coburn who had 18 months of corpsman training, and who was at the moment Harrington went down the person everyone naturally looked at. Coburn was good. He was a competent field medic who had performed well in the program's trauma assessments. He had, however, not identified the specific pattern of the injury in the first 20 seconds. She had Brant was watching through field binoculars from the elevated observation point 280 m northwest of the team's position. He saw Coburn move to Harrington and begin the standard assessment protocol. He also saw Vasquez move to Harrington at the same moment. Not ahead of Cobain, not in front of Coburn, but beside him and slightly lower, so that she was in the level while Coburn was still doing the initial check. Her hands were on the knee for 3 seconds. Then she said something Brant couldn't hear from 280 m. Whatever she said, Coburn listened. He stopped the protocol he had started, shifted his approach, and began the process she had apparently recommended. Brant put the binoculars down and looked at the tactical radio in his hand. And then he did something he did not do frequently, which was ask his observer to patch him to the team's frequency so he could listen to what they were saying. What he heard was not what he expected. What he heard was Elena Vasquez walking Coburn through a field stabilization protocol, through a combined ACL-MCL injury that was specific, sequenced, and not in the standard curriculum. She described the stabilization angle for the joint at 17 degrees of flex ion. She specified the padding placement to prevent the gust stress that would make the injury worse during movement. She gave Coburn a precise weight-bearing calculation based on Harrington's visible body mass. Roughly 195 pounds, she said, which was 3 pounds off his actual log weight, and told him what that meant for the carry distance back to the checkpoint. The team moved Harrington 4.3 kilometers in 91 minutes on Vasquez's protocol. And when the medical team at the checkpoint assessed him, the field stabilization was rated. In the documentation, Reeves later read as consistent with postgraduate orthopedic trauma management. Brant came down from the observation point at the end of the evolution and found Reeves at the debrief station. He set the binoculars on the table. He stood there for a moment. Where did she study trauma medicine? He said. Reeves looked at him. Her file doesn't say. Brant was quiet for a moment. Then he said her file is missing something. Yes, Reeves said. I think it is. He had been thinking about who to call for 4 days. He had a name in mind, a name he had not said out loud since 2019, the last time he had been in a room where it mattered. He was not ready to say it yet. But the outline that had been forming since day one, since 0614 and a half rotation at 847 m, was now something closer to a shape he recognized. He just hadn't looked at it directly yet. The live fire assessment on day 19 was supposed to be a routine element. Not the capstone, not the high-stakes evaluation, just a mid-program checkpoint in which Trainee ran a modified shooting course designed to test accuracy under light movement stress. The course was 7 stations with target engagements at distances ranging from 100 m to 450 m and a physical effort component between stations that was calibrated to elevate heart rate to approximately 75% of maximum before each shot. Nothing in the course design was designed to be a moment. It was designed to be a data point. It became something else because of what happened at Station 4. Station 4 was the 320 m position, elevated 6 m above the target line with a left-to-right crosswind that had been measured that morning at 8 knots. The target was a standard silhouette 18 and wide. The engagement window was 4 seconds after the trainee entered the station. The sequence was designed to be difficult, but not exceptional. Trainee after trainee went through. Reeves was at the master evaluation station watching the print out as the data came in. Hit percentages, engagement times, physiological notes from the monitoring equipment each trainee wore. The class average through the first 6 trainees at Station 4 was 72% within the engagement window, which was near the program mean. Elena Vasquez came through Station 4 at 0941. She entered the station already in her shooting position, not arriving at the station and then dropping to the position, but dropping into it during the final 2 steps of her approach, so that by the time she was fully still, she was already behind the weapon. The evaluator at the station marked her in-position time as 1.3 seconds. The program average for in-position time was 2.8 seconds. She fired at 2.1 seconds after station entry. The evaluation printout showed impact at the geometric center of the silhouette 0.4 in from the calculated point of aim for the measured wind conditions. Reeves looked at that number for a moment. 0.44 in at 320 m after a physical effort component at 1.3 seconds of position with a 2.1 second total engagement time. But none of that was what made Marcus Brandt, who was standing at the evaluation station looking at the same printout, become entirely still for approximately 8 seconds. What happened next. The range officer called a mandatory ceasefire at Station 5. A technical malfunction with one of the impact sensors on the downrange target array, which required a 2-minute halt while the technician reset the system. 6 trainees were staged between stations waiting. Vasquez was one of them, positioned near the approach path to Station 5, sitting on one knee in the way the program taught trainees to rest their legs between physical effort bursts. She was looking downrange, not at the station targets, downrange. Past the course, past the 450-meter position at Station 7, past the flag safety line, into the open coastal scrub that extended another 600 meters south of the course boundary. Reeves saw her looking. He followed her gaze and saw nothing. Brush, distance, the blurred line of the Pacific to the west. Then she said something to the trainee nearest to her, a man named Yates. Yates looked where she was looking. He said something back. She shook her head once. 12 seconds later, 2 figures emerged from the coastal scrub at 847 m, moving parallel to the course boundary. They were wearing civilian clothing and carrying what appeared at that range to be surveying equipment. They were moving in a pattern that would bring them into the impact zone of Station 7 within 6 minutes if they maintained their current trajectory, which they would not have known about because the civilian access restriction signs were positioned at the road entry point 3/4 of a kilometer east of where they had apparently come from. Range safety called a halt across all stations and dispatched the safety vehicle. No one was hurt. The civilians were redirected. The evolution resumed 11 minutes later, but Reeves spent those 11 minutes thinking about the fact that Elena Vasquez had identified 2 figures at 847 and moving through scrub in her peripheral vision while seated at rest after a physical effort component while surrounded by other trainees and the ambient noise of a live fire range. He thought about the first day, the half rotation, the same distance. He thought about what it means to see something at a distance that you have already been looking at in one form or another for long enough that your eyes find it without being asked. He called the number that evening, the one he had been not calling for 4 days. The phone rang 5 times. Then a voice he recognized said, "Reeves, I have a candidate," Reeves said. "I need to know who her file belongs to." The pause on the other end was exactly the kind of pause that tells you that the person on the other end of the line already knows the answer and is deciding how much of it to give you. "Read your orders from last Thursday again." The voice said the last paragraph. Reeves pulled the orders from the desk drawer. He had read them 4 times already. He read the last paragraph a 5th time. He set the phone down without ending the call. The last paragraph said that the training evaluator for the current advanced class was authorized at his discretion to assign candidates to a supplementary field assessment under class 4 operational parameters if the evaluator determined that a candidate's performance indicated readiness for evaluation beyond the standard curriculum. Class 4 operational parameters. That was not a training designation. He picked the phone back up. "How long has she been building this?" He said. Another pause. "Shorter this time." "Long enough," the voice said. The line went quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Reeves heard from somewhere in the background on the other end the sound of wind. The particular kind of wind that comes off elevation that sounds like it has traveled a long distance to arrive where it is. He had heard that wind before in a specific geography at a specific time in his career when he had been part of a team that had gone into a place and done a thing that had never been formally documented. He knew at that moment who she was. He set the orders back in the drawer. He did not say the name, not yet, but the outline was gone. What he had now was something solid, something with edges, something that had been there the whole time. Built piece by piece from 847 meters and a cleaning brush and a ball protocol he had seen used once before in 2011 at a joint training exercise that had never been formally documented either. The operational assessment came on day 23. Rhea had not been told the details in advance, which was unusual. He was typically briefed 3 days before any major assessment event. What he received instead was a set of operational parameters delivered by a lieutenant commander named Park, who arrived at the annex at 0700 with a classified briefing packet and the kind of expression that people wear when they are responsible for something that does not go in the written record. The scenario was this. An active surveillance asset operating in a coastal zone had developed a targeting problem. A specific individual, a man named Holland Croft, who had been moving weapons components through a civilian maritime network for 11 months, had identified the surveillance team's forward position and was now planning to relocate within a 72-hour window. Once relocated, the intelligence suggested he would be beyond the reach of the current operational architecture for a minimum of 6 months, possibly permanently. The surveillance team needed someone to move into a forward overwatch position at 1,100 m from Croft's current location, establish a firing solution from that position, and hold it for a period of up to 14 hours while the decision chain worked through the authorization protocol. If the authorization came through, the asset would execute. If it didn't, the asset would extract without engagement. The position was accessible by a route that required 2 water crossings. 3 kilometers of elevation gained through rocky coastal terrain and an approach to the overwatch site that had to be completed in darkness and silence because Croft had motion sensors placed at 200-meter intervals around his perimeter. Park said that the assessment team had been looking at the program's advanced class for this because the timeline did not allow them to bring in a dedicated asset for the primary pool. This was Park acknowledged outside the standard training architecture. It was not, he added, a training evolution. The authorization protocol was real. The 72-hour window was real. Reeves looked at the briefing packet for a moment. Then he looked at Park. You asking me to designate a trainee for live operational tasking. I'm asking you to designate an individual whose operational readiness you can verify. Park said the trainee classification is a file designation, not a capability assessment. Reeves thought about the ball brush, the 847 m, the 2 minutes and 58 seconds in darkness, the ACL protocol at 17 degrees. She's ready, he said. Hawk nodded once. He did not seem surprised. She's been ready, he said. We've been waiting for you to see it. That was the second time in 4 days that Ree had been told something that implied the process he thought he had been running. The observation, the question, the accumulation of evidence had actually been a process being run on him. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He set the briefing packet down. He picked it up again. She doesn't know the full picture, he said. Huff file. No, Pack said. When does she find out? Pack looked at the packet in Reeves's hands. When it becomes necessary. That's the protocol. Reeves thought about the last paragraph of his orders. Class 4 operational parameters at his discretion. He thought about what discretion actually means when the architecture around the discretion has been built in advance by people who know what you're going to decide. Get her briefed, he said. Full operational parameters. She deserves to know what she's walking into. Park's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, something more restrained. That's not standard. It is now, Reeves said. He briefed her himself at 1400 in the smaller of the 2 conference rooms at the annex's eastern end. The one that had the whiteboard with the hand-drawn topographic sketch that someone had done years ago and never erased. The lines of elevation running up the right side of the board in clean parallel curves. She sat across from him with a legal pad in front of her and a pen she never picked up. He laid out the operational parameters, the target, the route, the distance, the 72-hour window, the authorization chain. He told her about the motion sensors. He told her about the 2 water crossings and the elevation and the darkness requirement on approach. He told her that the authorization might not come. He told her she would have to hold the position regardless. She looked at the topographic sketch on the whiteboard while he talked. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Extraction route, she said. Single egress back the way you came. If the authorization comes during daylight hours, you hold and execute in daylight at 1,100 m with a daylight exposure. Yes. She looked at the whiteboard again. Wind pattern in that coastal zone runs southwest in the afternoon. Variable 9 to 14 knots, depending on the channel effect, off the headland. Reeves looked at her. How do you know the wind pattern in that specific coastal zone? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the legal pad in front of her. the one she hadn't written on. And she looked back at him. I've been in that geography before. She said the wind is one of the things that stays with you. She said it the way people say things that contain more than they are releasing. She didn't look away from him when she said it. She just said it and let it sit there between them. And Reeves looked at her face, really looked at it the way he hadn't allowed himself to do in 23 days of watching. And for the first time, he saw the thing he had been looking around the edge of since day one. It wasn't in her eyes. It was in the area around them, in the specific quality of stillness that certain faces develop when they have spent years learning to make no announcement about anything they are carrying. He had seen that quality before. He had seen it in a photograph that was part of a classified file he had been shown in 2019 of a man who had operated in that coastal geography for 7 years before going dark. The man's last name was Vasquez. Reeves did not say anything about this. He wasn't going to. Not yet. Not because of the protocol, but because the moment didn't call for it. The moment called for him to stay with the task in front of them both, which was the operation and whether she could do it. The weapon system, she said. Your choice within the available inventory. She looked at the whiteboard one more time. M110, or the 13 Malawian Kwaches Mod 7. The 13 Malawian Kwaches is available. I want the 13 Malawian Kwaches. The 13 Malawian Kwaches Mod 7 with a bolt-action sniper system chambered in 300 Winchester Magnum. Its effective range in standard atmospheric conditions was 1,300 m, at 1,100 m in a 9 to 4 knots variable wind. It was not the easiest tool available, but it was the most precise at that distance under those conditions in the hands of someone who had spent enough time with it to read the wind in that specific geography without being told the numbers. You've used the 13 Malawian Kwaches before? Reeves said. Yes. How much? She picked up the pen for the first time since she'd sat down. She turned it in her fingers once, a single rotation, and set it back down parallel to the legal pad. Enough, she said. She left the conference room at 14:17. Reeves sat at the table for a few minutes after she was gone. The topographic sketch on the whiteboard looked back at him. All those clean, parallel lines of elevation, the quiet geometry of a landscape that had been waiting for the right person to move through it. He thought about a man named Vasquez who had moved through a coastal geography for 7 years and then disappeared from the record. He thought about a daughter who cleaned a ball in 4 strokes and 3 and pre-calculated 847 m before the command was given. He thought about what it means to build something in darkness. He picked up the phone and made a second call, not to the number from 4 days ago, but to an archivist at a records division he had been in contact with only 3 times in his career, each time in connection with information that required handling protocols he did not enjoy using. I need a file, he said. The name is Vasquez. Military service record terminated 2017 coastal operations component. Whatever you can release under the class for authorization. That file has a hold on it. The archivist said, I know, Reeves said. I'm releasing the hold. There was a pause. That's going to generate some paper. Yes, Reeves said it will. He thought about Elena Vasquez in that conference room, turning the pen once in her fingers. He thought about the 2 water crossings in the darkness and the 11 months that Harlan Croft had been moving weapons components through a network that had, according to what was in the briefing packet and somewhat more in what was between the lines of the briefing packet, cost at least 4 people their lives in the 14 months before the surveillance operation had been established. He thought about what kind of person volunteers for a 1,100-meter shot at the end of a 14-hour hold in daylight with variable wind off a headland after 3 kilometers of elevation gain in darkness. He thought about what kind of preparation produces that kind of person. He thought about 7 years in a coastal geography, summers on the water, the specific wind pattern that runs southwest in the afternoon and stays with you. The archivist came back on the line. The file is coming through now, she said. Master Chief, there's a note attached. It says the release was anticipated. Yes, Reeves said. I imagine it was. She left the annex at 2200, carrying a pack that weighed 31 pounds with a 1 Malawian Kwacha Mod 7 broken down across her back in a padded carrier with water for 18 hours and rations for 36, and with a radio set to a frequency that went directly to Park's desk and secondarily to Reeves's, so that whatever happened in the next 72 hours, Two people who were not in the field would be hearing it. Reeves watched her leave from the eastern entrance of the main building. She crossed the lit apron of the parking area and went into the darkness of the scrub terrain beyond. And within 40 seconds, she was gone. Not faded, not indistinct, but entirely absent, as if the landscape had simply made a space for her and then closed again. Marcus Brandt was standing next to Reeves when this happened. He had been told the operational parameters of the assessment. Not the full classified picture, but enough to understand what the 72-hour window meant and who was walking into it. He watched the darkness where she had been 2 years prior service, he said. Reeves looked at the darkness. That's what the file says. Brandt was quiet for a long moment. The 11-knot wind off the Coronado Peninsula was still moving as it moved every night, carrying its salt and its cold off the water that was always there, always just past the edge of whatever you were looking at. What does the other half of the file say? Brandt asked. Reeves thought about what the archivist had sent him. The 7 years, the coastal operations designation that appeared in exactly 2 documents, both classified. The performance evaluations that read like technical specifications rather than personnel records, each one measured to the millimeter, each one written in the spare declarative language of someone who had learned very early. But the best way to describe capability was not to describe it at all, but simply to record what it had done. And the last entry in the file dated 2017, a year before it had gone dark, which said in the particular bureaucratic shorthand of classified records that the asset had been transitioned to a different operational status for reasons that were classified above the level of the document itself, and that all subsequent records will be maintained under a separate access protocol. Separate access protocol. He thought about a daughter who had been 8 years old in 2017. He thought about what you do with 7 years of operational knowledge when you're no longer allowed to use it, and when the person who most needs it is too young to receive it, and when the only form it can take is something that happens at elevation and in cold water and in darkness slowly over years at a distance from any record that might connect what you are building to what you are trying to give away. Her father built her, Reeves said by year before he disappeared. Brandt turned and looked at him. He was in that coastal geography for 7 years. Reeves said he knew every wind pattern in it. He knew the terrain. He knew the targets that would eventually come through it. He looked at the darkness where Elena Vasquez had gone. He spent 11 years after his official service ended teaching everything he knew to someone who would survive long enough to use it. And then he made sure she ended up here in front of this specific operation with this specific target, because this is the operation he would have run himself if he'd been allowed to finish. Brandt looked at the darkness for a long moment. Is she going to be okay? He said. Reeves thought about the ball brush, the 4 strokes, and the 3, the protocol from a joint training exercise that had never been formally documented. The protocol her father had used in 2011 at that exercise, cleaning his own weapon at the end of a range session in which Ree had watched a man engage a target at 900 m and adjust for a wind he had calculated without instruments by feel by the particular educated attention that comes from 7 years in a place the same attention he now understood that had looked out from a different face on day 1 of this program at 0614 on a September morning and found a secondary target at 847 m in 2 seconds. Without being asked. Yes, Reeves said. She's going to be okay. The wind moved through the scrub terrain in the dark beyond the parking apron, finding its way through the brush the way wind does, not by force but by persistence, filling every available space, traveling as far as it needs to travel to become itself. The file the archivist sent came through in 3 separate packets, each requiring its own authorization acknowledgement, each one slightly heavier than the last. The way SOT and truth get heavier the closer you get to their center. The first packet contained the service record of Gunnery Sergeant Rafael Vasquez, United States Marine Corps, Sniper Qualification Instructor, Joint Special Operations Attaché. Operational period 2004 through 2017. The record was 41 pages, which was standard for a career of that length. The performance evaluations were the spare declarative kind Ree had described to Brandt. Sentences that recorded events without inflating them, numbers without commentary, capability without announcement. At Camp Pendleton in 2006, Rafael Vasquez had qualified 34 Marine snipers in a single 12-week cycle, which was for more than any previous instructor cycle at that facility. The evaluation noted this without emphasis, the same way it might have noted that he had submitted his paperwork on time. In 2009, he had been attached to a Joint Special Operations Task Force operating in a coastal zone that was not named in the unclassified portion of the record. The attached evaluation noted that his contributions to the task force's targeting operations had exceeded the anticipated parameters of the attachment agreement, which was a language used when someone had done things that the original mission scope had not anticipated and could not contain. In 2011, he had participated in the joint training exercise that Reeves remembered. Reeves had been there as part of a visiting Naval Special Warfare delegation, one of 17 people in the room, when Vasquez had conducted a live-fire demonstration at 900 meters with an unassisted wind calculation that had come within half a minute of arc of the calculated solution. Ree had not spoken to him at the exercise. He had watched him clean the weapon afterward, the ball brush for strokes in 3, not 5 and 4, and had thought at the time that it was simply the way Vasquez had been taught or had taught himself. He had not thought about it again for 14 years. The second packet contained 3 pages. They were from a different part of the record, the part that had the separate access protocol, and they had been released partially with redactions that appeared as solid black bars covering approximately 40% of the text. What remained when read around the redactions told a story in the way that negative space tells a story by what it refuses to show. Rafael Vasquez had been involved in an operation in 2016 that had gone in a direction the operational chain had not authorized. The specifics of the direction were redacted. The outcome was noted. 2 friendly casualties, 1 compromised network in a classified designation that Reeve translated from his experience with this particular type of documentation as meaning that the asset had exposed something about the operation sponsor that the sponsor had not wanted exposed. Not the enemy, the sponsor, the man who had built the operation, the man on the inside. The third packet was 4 pages. It contained the final entry in the active service record, the 2017 transition to separate access protocol, and 3 addenda that had been filed under a different classification tier. The first addendum was a declaration of service completion with accommodation that was classified at a level that meant it could never be displayed or spoken about publicly. The second was a medical record summary indicating injuries sustained in an unspecified operational environment, a compound fracture of the left fur, damage to the right shoulder rotator cuff, and a traumatic brain injury classified as moderate, which in the language of military medicine meant something between functionally intact and permanently altered. The third addendum was a single paragraph. It said that as of March 2017, Rafael Vasquez had been administratively transitioned out of all active records, that his identity had been altered under a program Reeves recognized from separate briefing he had received in 2018, and that any contact communication or information transfer between the asset and family members was prohibited under the terms of the transition agreement. Any contact, any communication, any information transfer. Reeves read that paragraph 3 times. Then he looked up from a screen and thought about what it means to be prohibited from transferring information to your child, and what you do with that prohibition if you have spent 17 years building a body of knowledge that is in practical terms the thing your child is going to need most. You find another way. You don't call. You don't write. You don't appear at a doorway or send a message or leave a trail that the people watching you can follow back to the person you're trying to protect. You do something that leaves no record. You make the knowledge move without a signature. You find someone who has access to the program where your daughter will eventually arrive. And you build the curriculum inside her over years of indirect transmission through the people who knew you, through the exercises that produce the specific skills she'll need, through the equipment protocols and the wind calculations and the particular geography that she'll have to navigate alone. And you do all of this from a distance that is simultaneously the hardest thing you have ever done and the most precise. Not 2 years of prior service, 11 years of preparation. Reeves sat with the 3 packets on his screen for a long time. Outside the window, the coastal dark was complete. The kind of dark that has depth, that has weather in it, that has the sense of large distances being crossed by things that make no sound. Somewhere in that dark 11 kilometers north-northeast of the annex, a woman was moving through terrain her father had walked before her toward a position her father had calculated toward a target that her father had identified before he disappeared from every record that contained his name. Reeves thought about what Marcus Brandt had said on day 12. That's a lot of hours in cold water before this program. To move like that in the dark. Yes, Reeves thought it was at 0340. On day 24, Reeves's radio produced a single tone. The check-in signal from the forward position, which meant she had reached the Overwatch site, had established the firing position and was holding. The tone was followed by a brief burst transmission from Park Asset in position. Authorization chain active. Hold time begins now. Reeves loved the time and sat back in his chair. The authorization chain in an operation like this one moved through 4 separate decision levels, each of which had a minimum review period. The total minimum time from chain activation to authorization delivery under the best conditions was 6 hours. The maximum under standard bureaucratic conditions was 48. She would hold the position regardless. That was the protocol. That was what she had agreed to. At 0700, Marcus Brandt came into the monitoring room with 2 cups of coffee. He sat one on the desk next to Ree without being asked. He sat in the chair 3 feet to the left and looked at the radio. Any word, he said. Check in at 0340. Nothing since. Brandt drank his coffee. He looked at the radio for a while. Then he said, tell me about the father. Reeves thought about what he was authorized to share and what he was not. He thought about the difference between those 2 categories and whether that difference mattered this morning in this room with this man who had spent 22 years earning the right to be trusted with difficult information. He was a gunnery sergeant. Reeves said sniper instruction, Joint Special Operations. He operated in the exact coastal geography she's sitting in right now for 7 years before he was transitioned out in 2017. Brandt was quiet for a moment. Transitioned out. Why? He found something in an operation that someone didn't want found. And the person who didn't want it found had more institutional authority than he did. Brandt sat down his coffee. He looked at the radio. The target, he said, Holland Croft moving weapons components for 11 months. Yes. Is Croft connected to what T. Vasquez found in 2016? Reeves looked at the 3rd packet that was still on his screen. The single paragraph, the prohibition on contact, the 3 words that had stayed with him through the night, any information transfer, the operation Vasquez's father exposed, Reeves said, was a weapons network, a civilian maritime network moving components through a coastal zone. Someone on the inside was facilitating it and protecting it. And when Vasquez got close enough to identify the facilitator used the institutional authority he had to disappear the person who'd found him. Brandt was very still. Croft, Reeves said, has been running that same network or a reconstituted version of it for the past 11 months. The surveillance team believes it's the same infrastructure, the same maritime corridor, the same protection from inside. Who's the inside man now? Brandt said. Reeves looked at the screen. That's what the authorization chain is working through. Brandt looked at the radio again. He looked at it the way Reeves had been looking at it all night, with a particular quality of attention reserved for the thing you're waiting on and cannot hurry. She knows, Brandt said about her father. Not everything, not the transition documentation, not who the inside man was, but she knows why she's there. Reeves thought about the conference room. The legal pad. She hadn't written on the pen. She had turned once in her fingers and sat back down. The way she had said, I've been in that geography before and then gone still. As if the sentence had cost something that she was not going to account for in front of him. Yes, he said. She knows why she's there. At 11:40, the radio produced not a tone, but a voice haze at the volume of someone who is speaking into a transmitter while keeping their face against the ground, which reduced everything to its essential frequency. Wind shift west 11 to 16 gusting. Hart's voice came back immediately. Copy, hold position. A pause holding, she said. Reeves looked at the topographic sketch on the whiteboard. The one in the conference room, where he had briefed her, which he had photographed on his phone and was now looking at on the small screen. The coastal geography in that zone had a specific wind behavior in the afternoon hours. The prevailing southwest pattern that she had described in the briefing would sometimes in the hours between 100 and 400 encounter a channeling effect off the headland to the northwest that produced a secondary wind layer moving in the opposing direction. The result was a variable shear condition at the firing position, a condition in which two wind currents cross between the shooter and the target, requiring the shooter to calculate for both layers independently and then combine them into a single firing solution. This was not something the program taught. This was not in the marksmanship curriculum, not in the advanced components, not anywhere in the 31 pages of training documentation that covered long-range precision fire. It was, however, something that someone who had spent 7 years in that specific geography would know. It was something that person would have spent considerable time teaching in whatever indirect way was available to someone who was going to need it. Reeves looked to the topographic sketch and thought about a gunnery sergeant with a compound fractured femur and a moderate traumatic brain injury somewhere in the country under a different name who had spent the past 8 years finding ways to make information move without a signature, who had built a curriculum inside a person who was now lying in a forward overwatch position at 1,100 m from a target reading a winch, condition that was not in any manual in a landscape that had been his classroom, before it became Hare's. At 12:43, the radio went silent for 4 minutes. Then it produced a sound that was not a voice and not a tone. It was the particular digital artifact that a radio transmitter makes when it has been moved, when the person carrying it has shifted position. Then her voice again, rifle bearing 340, distance 80. Park, say again, bearing 340 from my position. 80 m. One rifle moving parallel. Reeves stood up. He looked at Park, who was on a second radio, immediately pulling up the surveillance team's current position data. She had identified a second individual, not the target, not the surveillance team, moving through the terrain 80 m from her concealed position, carrying a weapon on a bearing that would bring him across her approach route and potentially her position within the next several minutes. She was not asking for guidance. She was reporting. Park said into the second radio, "Can you confirm identity?" Her voice came back. Civilian clothing. Military movement. Left hand carry. Left hand carry. A weapon carried in the left hand in civilian clothing on a bearing that had no obvious civilian purpose in that terrain. It was the kind of detail that most people in a high-stress hold position after 14 hours would not have the bandwidth to register with that precision. It was the kind of detail that gets registered by the kind of training that puts a person in a cold bay in the dark and measures their navigational performance to the second, is a counter-surveillance element. Park said people they've expanded the perimeter. Reeves looked at the radio. He thought about the motion sensors at 200-meter intervals. She had gotten through those. But a mobile counter-surveillance element, a person, not a sensor, was a different problem. She's compromised if he reaches her position. Reeves said she's not asking for extraction. Park said. Reeves looked at the radio. He was right. She was not asking for anything. She had reported. She was waiting. Park said into the first radio, "Can you adjust position without detection?" A pause longer than any previous pause. "Give me 4 minutes," she said. Reeves looked at the clock. It was 12:49. He looked at the topographic sketch on his phone. In the zone where she was positioned, there was, according to the survey data that was part of the operational brief, a secondary elevation feature approximately 22 m northeast of the primary overwatch site. It was less favorable for the shot geometry. It changed the angle to the target by approximately 3 degrees, which at 1,100 m in a variable wind shear condition was not a negligible adjustment, but it would take her off the approach bearing of the counter-surveillance element. She had seen this on the topographic sketch in the conference room. He was certain of it now. She had been looking at that sketch, at the whiteboard, at those clean, parallel elevation lines, and she had already calculated the secondary position before she left the room. She had already filed it in the part of her preparation that she didn't announce. At 12:53, the radio produced a movement artifact again. Then silence. At 12:57, her voice new position adjusted geometry. Wind shear at approximately 12 degrees. 12 degrees of crossing wind shear at 1,100 m. Reeves worked the math. The correction required was not the kind of correction that a firing solution table covers. It was the kind of correction that requires the shooter to understand the wind as a physical phenomenon, to have internalized the behavior of ballistic projectiles in variable atmospheric conditions well enough that the calculation is not arithmetic, but something closer to translation. Authorization status, she said. Park looked at Reeves, then into the radio. Pending chain is at level 3. Level 3 of 4. Copy, she said. Holding. At 16:14, the authorization came. Level 4 cleared. For words from Park into the first radio, authorization confirmed. Clear to engage. For seconds of silence. Then a single transmission from the forward position. Not words, but a tone. The acknowledged tone. Reeves looked at the clock. 16:14. The wind in the coastal zone at this time, in the afternoon in this geography, would be at the peak of its channel effect. The safe west prevailing and the northwest secondary, both at near maximum expression crossing at the target zone, creating a she that was measurable at the position in both direction and velocity, but only calculable for the midpoint of the trajectory by someone who knew what the wind did between the two layers in that specific corridor at that specific time of day. He thought about a man who had walked that corridor for 7 years. He thought about what years feel like when they're being compressed into a single moment. When the 7 years and the 8 years since and the 17-year-old marksmanship foundation that the 7 years have been built on all arrive at a single point, 1,100 m and a variable wind and a bolt-action rifle in a secondary position at a non-optimal angle. And the decision to fire is made in the silence between a tone and the next thing that happens. He looked at the radio. He did not look away from it. The shot, when it came as silence, not the absence of sound. Reeves was not in the field, could not hear the report, but the silence of the radio, which told him that nothing had been transmitted, which meant there was nothing to transmit, which meant the thing that needed to happen had happened, and she was already moving into the next phase of her protocol. 11 seconds later, Park's second radio produced a Bose transmission from the surveillance team on the ground. Park listened. He looked at Reeves. Target down, he said. He said it the way you say something that has been a long time coming and has finally arrived. Not with relief exactly, but with the specific gravity of a thing that has weight because of what it cost to get there. The room was quiet. Reeves looked at the clock. 16:14 and 43 seconds. He wrote it down because he was a man who wrote down exact numbers, and because this was a number that deserved to be written outside the window of the monitoring room. The September afternoon light was doing what September afternoon light does in Quinonado, going golden and long, the kind of light that turns everything it touches briefly into something that looks like it was meant to be remembered. Brandt was in the room. He had come back in at 1400 without saying anything and had sat in the same chair and had not spoken since. He was looking at the radio when Park said target down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and picked up his coffee mug, which had been cold for 3 hours, and looked into it. He set it back down without drinking. That was all. That was the whole of it. The gesture, the mug, the setting it back down. But Reeves saw it, and he understood exactly what it meant. Because Marcus Brandt was a man who expressed what he was feeling through small, precise physical actions rather than through words. And the action of picking up a cold cup of coffee and looking into it and setting it down was the action of a man who has been holding a model of what human capability looks like, who has just been asked to revise it, and who is trying to figure out where the revision goes. She came back through the annex gates at 0221 the following morning, 32 hours and 21 minutes after she had left. The pack was still 31 pounds. She had consumed the rations and the water and packed the waste out, which was the protocol which she had followed. The 13 Malawian kwaches was on her back in the padded carrier, and as she was moving the way people move when I've been in the field for 32 hours and would prefer not to show it, which is to say she was moving at a steady control pace that was about 15% slower than her baseline, and she was not going to mention this. Reeves met her at the gate. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him. She did not say anything about the operation because there was nothing to say about it that was appropriate for the gate of a training annex at 0221. Reeves looked at her for a moment. He thought about the classified briefing room and the file and the single paragraph and the prohibition on contact and the information transfer that had traveled in the only direction it was allowed to travel downward. Invisible built into a person year by year, like the grain in old wood. Invisible until the light hits it right. "There's something in the file you should see," he said. "When you're ready." She looked at him. Her face in the gate light had that particular stillness. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Is it about my father?" "Yes." She looked at the gate light for a moment. It was the specific look of someone who has already prepared themselves for a thing and is not going to be diminished by the confirmation of it, but who needs a second, nonetheless, to let the confirmation arrive. "Okay," she said. She walked past him toward the processing station. She was carrying 31 pounds, 32 hours of field time. A shot at 1,100 m in a variable wind shear at 1614 on a September afternoon, and the knowledge that the answer she had been waiting for was now in a room she could walk into. She didn't hurry. The man who had been protecting Hollencroft's network from inside was named Deputy Director William Faber. He had held his position at the relevant agency for 19 years. He had been the authorization chain's level 3 when the operation had been activated, one of the 4 decision-level approvals that had moved the operation toward clearance. He had approved it because refusing to approve it at this stage with the documentation the surveillance team had assembled would have been a more visible act than approving it and then managing the aftermath. He had not expected the aftermath to be what it turned out to be. Reeves learned this in stages over the following 2 weeks through Park and through the archivist, and through a meeting he was called to in a building in Washington that had no publicly visible signage. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, a man whose name Reeves was not given, but whose institutional position was clear from the quality of the furniture he sat behind, told Reeves that Faber had been placed on administrative suspension pending a full operational review, that the review would be comprehensive and classified, and that the network infrastructure Croft had been running had been dismantled. Not in a public manner, not in a manner that produced news coverage or congressional testimony, but in the manner that things are dismantled when the person who built them has been revealed to people who have the institutional standing to dismantle it and the institutional interest in doing so without ceremony. Justice arriving quietly, not triumphantly, without a press conference, without a hearing, with the weight of everything that had been carried to get it there. 7 years of a man walking a coastal corridor. 11 years of a daughter being built in the dark. For people dead in a network that should have been stopped in 2016 when one gunnery sergeant got close enough to see who was running it and was disappeared for the trouble. The man behind the furniture told Reeves that the Vasquez file, both files, the fathers and the daughters, would be reviewed under the new operational framework. He used the word reviewed 3 times, which in a language of this kind of conversation meant something more specific than the word suggested. Reeves understood. He did not say so explicitly. He thanked the man and flew back to Quanadu. He went directly from the airport to the annex. He found Elena Vasquez in the range maintenance bay, performing a scheduled cleaning of the 13 Malawian quaches she had used in the field. It was a maintenance task she had not been required to perform. The weapon had already been logged back into the armory, but she had checked it out again and was working through the barrel in action with a focused efficiency that Reeves had been watching for 26 days. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He watched her. The ball brush moved through the barrel in 4 strokes on the push and 3 on the pull. She looked up and saw him in the doorway. Reeves thought about what he was going to say. He had been composing it on the flight back in the particular way that people compose things when they know the words are important and cannot be taken back once they are given. He had gone through several versions. He had discarded most of them because they were too large for the moment, or too formal, or too invested in explaining rather than simply saying. He settled on the version that was closest to what he actually meant. "The review is underway," he said. "The transition agreement. They're looking at whether the terms were applied legally." She set the ball brush down. She looked at him. "How long will the review take?" She said 6 months, maybe less. She looked at the 13 Malawian quaches in front of her. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been using carefully, that you have been taking care of, that you're going to have to put back and wait on. "Okay," she said. She picked up the ball brush. She continued. Reeves watched her for a moment longer. He thought about William Faber in his building with its furniture and its 19 years of institutional authority, sitting with a knowledge of what his calculation had cost, not just the 4 people in the network, not just Rafael Vasquez, but the specific quiet arithmetic of a daughter building herself in the dark toward a mission that should never have been necessary. He thought about Faber's face in the meeting transcript that Park had forwarded, a face that, in the photograph accompanying the administrative suspension documentation, showed the kind of containment that has been practicing for years and has just been told by something undeniable that it is not sufficient. He thought about what it had taken to put that expression on that face. The years, the geography, the 11-knot wind, and the variable shear, and the bolt-action rifle, and the 1100M, and the single moment at 1614 when everything that had been built in darkness arrived at its purpose. He thought about a man who had not been allowed to say any of this to his daughter, and who had found a way to say it anyway. Rees walked back across the annex to his office. The September afternoon was cooling toward evening, the light going from gold to the specific pale blue that precedes dark on the California coast, the kind of light that makes distances look larger than they are, that makes the water on the horizon seem farther away and also somehow more precise. He sat down at his desk. He looked at the clipboard he carried everywhere and at the notes he had made on day 1 and day 12 and day 14 and day 16. And he thought about how the notes described in their accumulation a thing he had been watching without being able to name until he had enough of it, and how the thing he had been watching was not, in the end, simply skill. It was biography. It was the life of a man he had seen once from a distance at a joint training exercise he had not thought about for 14 years, transmitted into a person who could not know where it had come from. Competence is character. What a person can do is who they are. He looked at the notes for a while. Then he turned the clipboard over face down on the desk. 6 months and 11 days after the operation, a package arrived at the annex address to Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Vasquez. She had been advanced and grayed at the end of the advanced training program, a decision that had required a Satan amount of institutional paperwork and had been completed without ceremony in a manner that most of the important things in this story had been completed. She was in the marksmanship instruction section by then, not as a student, but as an instructor, having been assigned to the program in a capacity that the official documentation described as curriculum development and advanced skills instruction, which was accurate as far as it went. What she was actually doing in the range bays and the cold water training area and the darkened maintenance rooms where trainee assembled weapons by touch was building something. She was taking the curriculum that existed and adding to it carefully, precisely. The things that the curriculum had not contained before she arrived. The variable wind shear calculation, the coastal geography adaptation protocols, the specific bore maintenance sequence from a foreign rifle qualification program that had turned out to be one of the most efficient sequences in the field. The things that had come to her through channels that didn't appear in any official record. She was teaching them now. They would appear in the record going forward. The package contained a single item, a photograph printed on standard paper, unframed. It showed 2 people at an outdoor shooting range, a man and a girl of approximately 7 years old, both prone behind a rifle. The man's hand visible at the edge of the frame, not touching the weapon, but positioned near it in the way a teacher's hand rests near something a student is doing, close enough to correct, far enough to allow. The range in the photograph was not a military facility. It was open terrain, elevated with a specific quality of light that comes off high desert in the late afternoon. The back of the photograph had a date, 2010, and 6 words written in handwriting she recognized from the practice of knowing a thing before you have proof of it. The 6 words were, "The wind will tell you the rest." She looked at the photograph for a long time. She was sitting at her desk in the instructor's office at the eastern end of the annex building. And outside the window, the Coronado coastline was doing what it always did, presenting itself in the particular combination of salt air and distance and light that had been there before the annex was built and would be thereafter. The 11-knot wind off the peninsula was moving through the brush on the eastern perimeter, audible through the window glass, carrying its information to anyone who knew how to read it. She set the photograph down in front of her. She did not move for a moment. Then she opened the bottom drawer of the desk where she kept the curriculum material she was developing, and she pulled out the yellow legal pad she had been using for the new marksmanship module, the one that would cover variable wind conditions in coastal geography, the one that did not yet exist in the program's official documentation. She had been working on it for 3 weeks. It was 41 pages. She turned to page 42. She picked up a pen. She did not hold it for a moment or consider it. She began to write. Outside the window, the wind moved through the brush on the perimeter of the annex westward toward the water, carrying whatever it was carrying toward the place where all that distance becomes use. She wrote in the same spare declarative language that is the only appropriate language for things that matter. She described the wind as a physical phenomenon measurable and predictable with specific behavior in specific geographies. She described the way it channels off headlands in the afternoon hours. She described the sheer condition and the calculation that resolves it. And she described it with the precision of someone who has earned the knowledge through elevation and cold water and darkness, and the accumulated weight of every person who walked the terrain before her and found it worth understanding. She wrote without stopping. On the desk beside the legal pad, facing forward, the photograph showed a girl of 7 at a rifle in high desert light with a man's hand near the edge of the frame, not directing, not controlling, only present. And the light in the photograph was the particular late afternoon light of a place that holds its lessons in the terrain and waits for the person who is ready to receive them. She had written 4 pages before she looked up again. The wind was still moving through the brush, steady and legible, as if it had somewhere specific to be. The first class she taught the new module to was a group of 14 advanced candidates, 9 men and 5 women, all of them at the same stage of the program she had been at 7 months earlier, past the initial pipeline, moving through the specialized skills phase, carrying the particular flatness of expression that the program produced and that she now recognized as something other than blankness. It was economy. It was the face learning to conserve what it would need later. She taught the wind module on a Tuesday in late March when the coastal conditions were close to what she had written about a southwest prevailing at 9 knots with the afternoon channel effect beginning to build off the headland by 1300. She took the 14 trainees to the eastern range at 0900 before the channel effect arrived, and she spent 2 hours establishing the baseline. She did not begin with theory. She began with observation. "Find north," she said. "Don't use a compass." 14 trainees looked at the terrain, the sky, the light. 11 of them gave her the correct bearing within 4 degrees. 2 were off by 11 degrees. One, a trainee named Okafor, 24 years old, former Army Ranger, a man who had the kind of physical confidence that comes from being very good at most things for most of his life, gave her a bearing that was 18 degrees off. She did not correct him verbally. She walked to where he was standing and turned so that she was facing the same direction he was facing. She said, "What is the wind doing on your left cheek?" Okafor thought about this for a moment. Moving from where to where? He took a moment. He was paying attention now, which was different from the attention he had been paying before. "From my left to my right. And where is your left cheek facing?" A pause. He recalculated. He shifted 11 degrees, then 7 more. He was now facing within 2 degrees of Trinoth. "The wind is a compass," she said to the group. "In this geography, in the morning hours before the channel effect builds, it runs northeast to southwest at a bearing between 210 and 225 degrees true, which means if you feel it on your left cheek, while facing what you think is north, you're 18 degrees off." She looked at the group. 14 people just found north. One of them found it with his face. She said this without emphasis. She was not making a point about Okafor. She was making a point about the wind. Okafor looked at her. He was not embarrassed, which told her something useful about him. He was simply recalibrating, which told her something more useful. At 1300, the channel effect arrived. She watched the 14 trainees feel it before they understood it. The slight shift in the prevailing direction, the way the air seemed to come from 2 places at once, the momentary confusion that the body registers before the mind has the vocabulary to name it. She watched their shooting positions adjust, and then readjust, and then in 4 of the 14 freeze into a kind of indecision that was the tactical equivalent of a held breath. "You feel that," She said that's the shay. 2 layers of air moving in different directions, crossing between you and your target. The question is not which one to correct for. The question is what happens between the 2 layers in the midpoint of the trajectory. She pulled the legal pad from the side pocket of her kit. She had written the calculation on page 43. Not the formula exactly, but the logic of it. The way you reason through a crossing wind when you cannot measure the midpoint directly, but can infer it from the behavior of the 2 layers you can measure. She had spent 4 evenings on those 2 pages. She had written them in the same spare declarative language and then revised them 3 times. Each revision removing 1 more word than it added, until what remained was the minimum necessary amount of language to convey the maximum necessary amount of precision. She had been taught this principle indirectly by a man who had never used more words than the thing required. You have 2 data points, she said, the wind at your position and the wind at the target position, which you estimate from the vegetation movement in the target zone. The midpoint is not the average of those 2 data points. It is a function of the trajectory arc, which means the midpoint wind is more heavily weighted toward the muzzle end of the trajectory, because that is where the projectile is traveling fastest and is therefore most influenced by lateral force. She showed them a calculation. She worked it through a specific example, the exact parameters from the September operation, though she did not say so. 1,100 m. Southwest at 12, northwest at 14, crossing at approximately 40 degrees divergence. She did not tell them where the numbers came from. The numbers were real numbers. They had earned their place in this curriculum by being used. Okafor worked through the calculation on the notepad she had issued. He came up with a firing solution that was, by her calculation, 0.7 minutes of arc off the correct solution, which was at 1,100 ma miss. What did you weight the midpoint at? She said he showed her his work. He had used the arithmetic mean equal weighting as if the wind were uniform across the trajectory. The projectile is traveling at approximately 2,900 foot-pers at the muzzle. She said at 1,100 m, it has decelerated to approximately 1,400 foot-pers. The transit time through the first half of the trajectory is 0.6 seconds. The transit time through the second half is 0.9 seconds. She looked at him. The wind has more time to act on the round in the second half, but the round is also traveling slower in the second half, which means lateral deflection per unit of wind force is larger. She let him sit with the math. He worked it again. His second solution was 0.2 minutes of a rough. At 1,100 m, that was a hit. Depending on the target size, it was a center mass hit. He looked up from the notepad. She had moved on to the next trainee. Marcus Brandt came to observe the module on the second day of instruction. He stood at the back of the range and watched without saying anything for 2 hours. At the lunch break, he found her at the equipment table. Okafor is going to be something. He said is already something. She said he just doesn't know what yet. Brandt looked at the range where the trainees were eating and checking their equipment in the way trainees do with the practiced, partially automatic attention to gear that becomes involuntary after enough time in the program. The calculation you're teaching, he said, the midpoint weighting that's not in the standard curriculum. It will be, she said. He looked at her for a moment. He had been doing this periodically since September, looking at her with the specific expression of a man who has updated his model of something and is still 6 months later adjusting to the updated version. Where did you learn it? He said she was organizing the range cards for the afternoon session. She aligned them on the equipment table with the same precision she brought to everything. Edges parallel, corners squared, as if the act of ordering small things was a practice she had been maintaining for years, which it was from someone who spent a lot of time in the wind. She said she didn't look up from the range cards. She didn't look up, and Brent didn't ask again. He stayed for the afternoon session and watched her teach the second half of the module. The extraction of firing solutions from real-time observation. The way you read grass movement and dust and the surface disturbance on standing water to build a wind picture without instruments. At the end of the afternoon session, he watched her send the 14 trainees back to the administrative building for the day's debrief. He watched them go, all 14, moving with a purposeful tiredness of people who have been made to think harder than they expected and are carrying the weight of new information they have not yet had time to organize. He looked at Vasquez, who was breaking down the equipment station. The ones who come through this program in the next 10 years. He said they're going to use what you're building. Hey, she set the last piece of equipment in the carry case. She closed the latches, 3 of them, in sequence. The way you close something that contains things that matter. That's the idea, she said. The letter from the Records Review came on a Wednesday in April. It arrived through official channels in a standard administrative envelope with a classification marker that Reeves recognized when he saw it in the pile on his desk and set it aside for her personally rather than routing it through the standard mail process. He walked it to the instructor's office at the eastern end of the building. She was at her desk working on what appeared to be the next module in the curriculum series. Page numbers visible from the doorway somewhere in the 50s. He set the envelope on the desk in front of her. She looked at the classification marker. She looked at Reeves the review. He said she picked up the envelope. She did not open it immediately. She held it for a moment with both hands with a specific quality of stillness that comes before an action you have been preparing for long enough that the preparation has become its own kind of waiting. Then she opened it. Reeves stayed in the doorway. He was not going to read it over her shoulder. He was simply present, which was the appropriate thing to be. She read it in approximately 90 seconds. She read it twice. He could tell from a slight pause at the end of the first read and the way his eyes tracked back to the top of the page for the second pass. When she finished the second read, she set the letter on the desk. The letter said, and Reeves knew this because Park had told him the substance of the review's findings 3 days earlier, that the transition agreement applied to Rafael Vasquez in 2017 had been found to have been initiated under procedural circumstances that did not meet the legal standards required for that classification of separation. That the review board had determined that the restriction on contact and communication had been improperly applied as a condition of the separation, and that the administrative record of Rafael Vasquez had been restored to its pre-2007 status, with all combinations reinstated, and that the separate access protocol had been dissolved. It also contained a current contact address. She looked at the letter on her desk for a long time. The afternoon light through the office window was the same pale gold that had been in September, the same light that turns the Coronado coastline briefly into something that looks designed to be remembered. It came through the window at the angle that hit the desk directly, and the letter lay in that light, and she sat with it. Reeves waited in the doorway. She looked at the window for a moment. She looked at the photograph on her desk, the one that had arrived in the package in February, the man and the girl in high desert afternoon light, the hand near the edge of the frame. Then she looked at the legal pad, page 54 of the curriculum she was building. She looked at it the way you look at something you're going to return to, not something you are walking away from. She reached into the desk drawer and took out a plain sheet of paper and a pen. Reeves understood that this was private. He stepped back from the doorway. He walked down the corridor toward his office, past the fluorescent lighting and the smell of cleaning solvent and the whiteboard visible through the open door of the conference room. The topographic sketch still there, the clean parallel elevation line still running up the right side of the board, unchanged. He went into his office. He sat down. He looked at the clipboard on his desk, still face down where he had placed it 7 months ago. He turned it over. The notes were still there. 847 minutes and 2 seconds pre-calculated a 1540 cold water, first leg, 258 darkness assembly. He read them in sequence, as he had on the afternoon he had made them, and he thought about the outline they had formed before he was ready to name it, and the shape they had become when he finally allowed himself to look at it directly. And the thing they turned out to be, a biography, a man's life given to a daughter in the only form that was allowed, which was also the most complete form possible. He set the clipboard back down, right side up this time. Outside his window, the November wind off the Coronado Peninsula was doing what it always did, arriving, measuring, finding every gap in the structure around it, and moving through, steady and legible, carrying everything it had gathered on its way to where it was going. In the instructor's office at the eastern end of the building, on page 54 of a curriculum that did not yet exist in any official record, but a woman was building something that would outlast the moment it was made in. And on the desk beside the legal pad, a letter lay open in the afternoon light. And beside the letter, a sheet of plain paper on which she had written in the spare declarative language of someone who has been taught that the minimum necessary words are also the most powerful ones. Exactly what she needed to say to someone who had been waiting 11 years to read it. She wrote the address on the envelope. She sealed it. She set it on the corner of the desk, where she would not forget to take it. Then she picked up the pen and turned to page 55. The wind moved through the brush on the eastern perimeter of the annex, westward as always, toward the water, finding its way through every available space, traveling as far as it needed to travel to become what it was. Not because the distance was required, but because that was the nature of the thing, to cover every inch of ground between where it began and where it was needed, and to arrive carrying everything it had learned on the OK.